Hey class, welcome back to American and Texas Government. In today's video lecture, we're going to talk about American foreign policy from the 1940s into the present. I'm going to divide this into three basic eras. The Cold War era, the era of humanitarian interventions after America wins the Cold War, and then the War on Terror more recently. Okay? Now, within these three eras, what's really changing, one of the more important things that's changing, is the polarity of the international system. Okay? So before the Cold War, before World War II, you had a multipolar international system. This was true before World War I through World War II. So when I say you had a number of countries who were evenly distributed, the power was evenly distributed between these countries. No one had an abundance of power more than the next country, right? So if you think of the Germans and the British and the Ottoman Empire and the Russians, you have a number of countries who are about evenly positioned in terms of power and force. Now, if you fast forward to the end of World War II, through the course of these two world wars, some of these empires, like the Ottomans, they don't even exist anymore. Others are greatly diminished. The British are suffering. The Germans are devastated. And really, the real winners of World War II are the Americans and the Russians. Notice the Americans weren't even on my list of powerful countries before this era, right? So America has really made a move up between the world wars, okay? So now we have a bipolar system, the Americans versus the Soviet Union. Only two competitors vying for world power. To deepen or make this bipolar system more complex or really quite competitive is a fundamental difference between capitalism or communism, or the two ways of life which govern this era, right? So these are both really economic systems, though there are governing elements to both. Capitalism is the economic system built out of John Locke's theory of private property. Individual property rights are important. The private market, the laws of supply and demand determine market winners and market losers, how much of a good is distributed. And some of the benefits are that you tend to have the correct amounts of goods produced and distributed through society. Excellent products tend to be rewarded and win in competitions for market space. And as opposed to communism, where industries tend to be nationalized. The government tends to own the resources and the means of production, and instead of supply and demand determining market allocation, the government will make these determinations, right? So in a purely communist country, the government owns the resources and determines how much of certain things are produced. Because humans, instead of the market, is making the decision of how much of this and that to produce, you don't tend to produce as good of a product because there's little and less competition between firms to make a thing. You don't necessarily produce the correct amounts of goods. So at the end of the day, these things that we studied in the last unit, like GDP and unemployment, these economic indicators of success are going to be ticking along a little bit naturally at a better rate in capitalist countries versus communist countries throughout this Cold War era. Okay, at least this is the perspective from a good capitalist, right? But what I've described here is a fundamental difference between ways of life between capitalism and communism, right? So in this bipolar system, there's a deep competition, not just for power, but for identity and for the proper way of life. Now, because the world wars have been devastating, and America and Russia and the Soviet Union are both large and powerful countries. And because of the development of the nuclear weapon, atomic bomb at the end of World War II, both parties wish to avoid an all-out nuclear holocaust. We refer to this as MAD, mutually assured destruction. The notion that if America and Russia both started shooting nuclear weapons at one another, both countries would be devastated. Now, this occurs because during the late 1940s, early 1950s, both parties understand that they've won and they need to compete with the other for world power. So they're both building large amounts of nuclear weapons, right? So if we are to get into a military confrontation, it's going to be an all-out destruction, all-out confrontation, okay? So by the time we get to 1960, the election of JFK in November, we have this sort of notion that's set up, okay? Because of mutually assured destruction, we're going to, in some regards, separate the territory between the Soviets and the Americans. The Americans are going to adopt something known as the containment policy, which is going to follow from what they understand to be the domino effect theory. Effectively, even though capitalism is a better way of life than communism, communism can be an attractive way of life. It had a tendency to spread from nation to nation in the 20th century. Therefore, the fear was that if one nation fell to communism, like Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos and the other nations next door are going to follow along with it. So in order to prevent the spread of communism, because we can't get into a direct confrontation with the Soviets, of course, we are going to contain communism in the nations where it presently exists, okay? So during this era, one of the things that's going to occur here is that this sort of train of thought is occurring on both sides, all right? So if you think about the nation of Cuba in 1961, this is a communist country just off the coast of Miami. In the context of where do we not want the Soviets to have a nuclear base, this is one of those places, okay? So the Kennedy administration hatches together a plan, and I'd encourage you to do a little research. I'm going to move fairly quickly through these historical events, but if it's interesting, do a little more reading. This is a fascinating era in world history. Kennedy supports, at least he's going to begin supporting, a planned insurrection or rebellion of some Cuban rebels, okay? So initially the Americans are going to support this rebellion to take down the Cuban government with air cover and the like. But we're worried about the Russians knowing that we're involved, so at the last minute Kennedy decides to take his fingerprints off of this. The Cuban rebels go it alone and are devastated by the Cuban military, okay? This event and the fact that Kennedy backs out at the last moment convinces Khrushchev, the Soviet Secretary General, that Kennedy is weak, that he can take advantage of this and assert his dominance in the region. So this leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Khrushchev is going to attempt to send nuclear-armed missiles on ships to Cuba. And essentially what happens during this very tense and interesting week-long standoff is that the U.S. Navy and the merchant ships are sort of at a standoff in the Atlantic, while Kennedy and Khrushchev are working and negotiating back channels to resolve an end to this standoff. Okay, this is one of the events that's going to really convince us that of all of the truthfulness, I guess I should say, of all of these theories. An all-out direct confrontation with the Russians is really, really devastating, or would be really devastating, and therefore it's in our interest to contain communism where it exists. Okay. Now, it's for these reasons that we get a proxy as someone who stands in for someone, right? So instead of having a direct confrontation, the Cold War is just that. No hot bullets being shot between the Americans and the Russians. Instead, relations were cold and tense, right? So there were proxy wars. If you look at something like the American war in Vietnam, this is a great example of a proxy war. We're attempting to help contain the spread of communism in Asia. When the Soviets go into Afghanistan, this is another good example of a proxy war. They're attempting to spread communism to that region. Okay. So okay. So this is a picture of the Berlin Wall. And so one of the lessons that the Cuban Missile Crisis and the general tendency of the 50s and 60s teaches us is that what's a better way of putting this? the standoff is going to essentially be very real during this era. Okay, so the Soviets are going to put what we refer to as the Iron Curtain up, right? So the eastern nations of Europe are going to be controlled by the Soviets following the agreements after World War II. The Americans are going to have a greater influence on Western Europe, right? And I wanted to mention, I always mention this picture in class because it does such a good job of demonstrating some of the differences between capitalism and communism as a basic way of life, right? This is a period in history where Germany was divided between East and West Germany, and this is East Germany on this side, and West Germany on this side, the communist and capitalist sides of the wall respectively. The differences are just the graffiti on the one side and a stark blank white wall on the other, an individual walking his dog on one side and a barbed wire and a large empty space on the other with a military patrol. Gloom on one side and a more hopeful side on the other, right? This is so when a good capitalist talks about how much better capitalism was, you can indeed back it up with some real evidence here. Okay, to demonstrate the expanse of the nature of the Cold War and how important some of these proxy wars were. Let's see here. You can see here how we have divided Europe between East and between the Soviet-influenced Warsaw Pact and the Western-influenced NATO regions here. And the red X's represent Soviet attempts at insurgencies in capitalist-influenced countries, and the blue X's in red countries are countries who are under the general purview of communism or a Soviet-influenced country where America or our allies have some sort of insurrection in order to try and influence the region into a capitalist region, right? So these are all examples of proxy wars, or ways in which both parties are trying to influence smaller countries to bring them over into our worldview. Essentially, it's a competition between red and blue countries, and we're trying to make the whole map either red or blue during this era. A little bit like like that board game Risk, if anybody remembers that. Following the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union will essentially cave in on itself at the end of the Cold War, right? Economically, they just can't keep up. And there's no big military event that ends the Cold War. It simply, the Soviet Union simply loses power. When this occurs, we go from a bipolar system to a unipolar system, okay? So instead of having a competition for power, the United States has an opportunity here to be what we call the hegemon, or the predominant main actor within the system. So I refer to this as the era of humanitarian intervention, 1990 to the start of the war on terrorism when we were attacked, because in many of the undertakings that we get into here, and instead of discussing these in detail, I'm going to ask you guys to do just a little bit of research on these if you're not familiar with them, right? But Saddam Hussein in Iraq attempts to invade the really tiny neighbor next door, Kuwait, and we stick up for Kuwait. In Somalia, a warlord is attempting to take war rations that should be distributed to, not war rations, but food rations that the UN is trying to give them. Really poor country. We go in to help the poor people, essentially. In Kosovo, a dictator you have an ethnically diverse region, and a dictator is trying to take over portions of this region. The UN comes in and tries to stop him from committing acts of war crimes and genocide, right? What we're trying to do is we're going into regions where we don't necessarily have strong allies to win them over, bring them onto our side, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more in the next lecture about what the goal there is in doing so. And 2001 through the present, we'll refer to this as our war on terrorism. And, essentially what's occurring in this era, and if you don't know much about some of these conflicts, again, do a little research and look them up in this online format. We're just challenged with time, time on the lecture format. But essentially what we've learned in this era is that not everybody believes that they wish to participate in a capital Western liberal type of of society, right? So there's some resistance to American hegemony. And that's one of the sort of crossroads at which we currently find ourselves. In the next lecture, I'd like to talk a little bit about the economics of internet.